right, it is 4:30, so I'm going to go ahead and get started. Looks like we have 21 people with us so far, and I imagine that will grow in the next few minutes, so I'll try to start off slow here. I'm going to share my screen. I have a PowerPoint presentation to go through today. And just to warn everybody, I've had some internet instability today, so I'm hoping that it got it all out of its system, and this will be fine. But we'll see. Okay, well, today we are talking about healthy relationships and healthy lives. And my name is Emily Spence. I'm the Associate Dean for Community Engagement and Health Equity and an Associate Professor in the School of Public Health at the UNT Health Science Center. I am very grateful to Fort Worth ISD for partnering with the HSC on this series of webinars. And I want to thank every person who's joining us this afternoon. I can't imagine that it's easy to log into a webinar at the end of a day, and I truly appreciate your investment of time and energy. Today, we're going to focus on healthy relationships and their importance to achieving life balance. We'll talk primarily about adult and family relationships, but you may find that some of the lessons learned about communication and boundary setting are also helpful in other aspects of your life, including your workplace and your teaching environment. Before we get started, I'll share a little bit about myself. I have a bachelor's, master's, and PhD in social work and have spent almost the last 9 years working for the HSC School of Public Health doing community-based research. My areas of expertise include interpersonal violence, healthy lifestyles, health disparities, and solution-focused dialogues. I'm also a Fort Worth ISD mom. All 3 of my kids have been raised in the district, and they are now 21, 18, and 13. And from a personal perspective, I know the hardships of relationships and divorce, as well as the challenges of single parenting and raising teenagers. In other words, I'm human. So not unlike a coach, I come to you with some expertise drawn from study, observation, professional practice, and some of my own limited experiences. And extending this sports analogy, a select few of you may have absolutely fantastic relationships. You may have found your winning team and identified skills and strategies that you practice on a regular basis to stay strong and successful. However, this is probably not true for the majority. So today I'm hoping we can focus on recognizing the distinction between what you can and cannot change in relationships. Most of us won't ever be able to slam dunk a basketball like this photo of Dwight Powell, because the average heights of Americans range from 5'4" to 5'9", and slam dunking is considered very achievable only for people over 6 feet, and considerably harder the shorter you are. I've included this particular photo taken last weekend when the Mavs beat the Lakers, because that game would have probably been lost if the Mavs hadn't changed their strategy and employed incredible teamwork in the last half. Similarly, the health of relationships is influenced by so many factors, both in and outside of our families. And these influences are constantly changing. What worked for you when your kids were 8 years old isn't going to work when they're 16. Intimate partnerships also evolve over time because as humans, we are constantly developing. The pandemic in particular has put incredible pressures on people, We've been isolated from our larger support networks and clustered more closely with people that we might. Some families are facing unemployment and are also struggling with being able to meet other basic needs. All of these factors impact how we relate to one another. And today we'll focus on some skills and strategies that you can practice to promote the health of your relationships. We'll also recognize that the limits of those strategies and talk about situations when you may feel like you need additional supports. Why are relationships so important? What decades of research studies have shown us is that the problems in our relationships will ultimately lead to problems in our health. This occurs through a cascade of chain reactions. Strained relationships, social isolation, and lack of support leads to depression, chronic stress, and creates inflammation in our bodies. This in turn lowers our general satisfaction with our lives. It leads to chronic disease and ultimately leads to a shorter lifespan. This is why it's just as important to improve your relationship health as it is your physical health. Achieving a life balance is about seeking health in all aspects of your life, including seeking healthy relationships and setting limits at work with your loved ones and assuring you have adequate social support network and making time and space for self-care. So let's take a quick pause here. I'm going to throw up a polling question. I just want you to take polling question number 1. So the question is, women who blank during conflict with their spouse compared to women who did not had 4 times the risk of dying. So for those of you on a computer, if you could go ahead and vote. And just as a reminder, I'm just asking you to answer question number 1. Oh, I see it's saying you can't submit without answering all the questions. Okay, thank you for letting me know. Yeah, so go ahead. I'll leave the poll up for another maybe 1 more minute, just so that people can read all questions, and then we'll kind of walk through each poll question as we get to them. Okay, 10 more seconds. I'll leave it open. Maybe a little more than 10 seconds. It looks like there's still some active votes coming in. So I'm gonna wait for it to pause for a minute here. Most people voting. All right, so I'll end the poll and share the results. So just looking at this first question, the correct answer is self-silenced. So what we know about relationships and health is that stuffing our feelings and muddling forward will ultimately do us harm in the long run. So relationships in general are hard. They require continuous work, and for many people have been unsuccessful, at least at one point in their lives. In Texas, at least 1 out of every 3 women and 1 in 4 men report experiencing violence in a current or past relationship. And even when people manage to end dysfunctional relationships and move on, the damage tends to linger. We see this showing up as higher rates of physical health problems, as well as trauma that impacts future relationships. But I think it's important to recognize there aren't just 2 kinds of relationships, abusive or not abusive. Instead, studies show them to be on a continuum, with abusive and damaging relationships on one end and very healthy and satisfying relationships on the other. Thankfully, the data leans more towards happiness than abuse. And the majority of married and cohabiting people believe that their partners are faithful, acting in their best interests, and honest. However, much lower proportions of couples indicate that they are satisfied with their communication, division of chores, parenting, and romantic life together. So there's definitely room to grow for most people. So we're going to go to the second polling question, and I will share these results here. So emotional disengagement is a pattern that is observed by the lack of positive affect during a conflict. No interest, affection, humor, or empathy. When this is present, couples are likely to get divorced an average of blank years later. It looks like most people chose 5 years. It's interesting, 0 people chose the correct answer. So the correct answer is actually 16 years. That emotional engagement or emotional disengagement occurs in relationships that are ending for a longer period of time. So we'll talk about why that is in a little bit. So in the 1970s, the Gottman Institute began exploring factors that differentiated happily versus unhappily married couples. In a series of studies conducted over decades with thousands of couples, they refined their research approach and developed a lab to monitor interactions between couples as well as between parents and children. In 7 longitudinal studies, the Institute began to uncover factors that could predict divorce, as well as characteristics of violent and abusive partners. As these longitudinal studies continued, the Gottman Lab also built an apartment to monitor couples in their day-to-day interactions. In this setting, they learned about how couples establish friendship and intimacy. Here, they were able to distinguish between factors that tend to result in marriages being dissolved within several years, an average of 5.6, as well as that emotional disengagement that we talked about that predicted divorce after a longer period of time, 16.2 years. In their studies, they often ask couples to revisit a conflict that the couple had argued about. And what they found was that there were 4 very damaging characteristics of arguments that often led to divorce. These are what the Institute calls the 4 horsemen of the apocalypse, and they include criticism, contempt, defensiveness, and stonewalling. Starting with criticism, the Gottman Institute clarifies that it is normal and okay for people to have complaints about each other, and there are effective ways to voice these complaints or critiques. However, criticism shows up as a generalization about the person rather than the behavior. So when people say things like, "You never do anything nice for me, you don't care about us," they are attacking the person rather than the behavior that is concerning for them. Contempt takes criticism to the next level and is the single greatest predictor of divorce. Contempt involves disrespect, mocking, sarcasm, ridicule, name calling, cussing at each other, and mimicking. So escalating the prior example in a contemptuous way might include a statement like, "You are a selfish jerk and you only care about yourself." So it's an escalation of that criticism. Defensiveness tends to be a response to criticism and is characterized by an unwillingness to examine your own role in the conflict and often includes a reversal of blame. So rather than respond to a criticism or even a complaint or critique, a defensive action may be to deny that the criticism altogether, and escalate it to turn the tables and accuse their partner of being the cause of all the problems, or even accusing their partner of being hypocritical and doing the same thing. So rather than address the complaint at hand, they redirect the focus back to their partner. Finally, stonewalling involves a complete retreat or withdrawal from the conflict. It's often a response to contempt, and the stonewalling partner simply tunes out and disengages from the argument. So these four horsemen are indicators of active problematic conflict. And when they are observed together, a relationship has a pretty high chance of failure within several years. However, you can see from the data that emotional disengaged conflict is a major concern as well. So even if you don't have a problem with the four horsemen, if you or your partner have become emotionally numb to the conflict in your relationship, that will be detrimental in the long run too. A substantial conclusion drawn by all of the Gottman Institute studies is that conflict is normal for relationships. There are no relationships without conflict. It's how we manage the conflict that predicts what happens next. Physical violence, sexual violence, and threats are the larger, more overt indicators of an abusive relationship. And if these are present, they tend to emerge slowly over time. People who use abusive strategies are often very charismatic in the beginning because they are intentional about building a relationship where they will have control. It's really very similar to the distinction between overt and covert racism that is experienced by many Black and Brown Americans. If you are interviewing for a job and the person interviewing you is using racial slurs, you're probably going to decide that's not the right workplace for you right up front. However, if they say all the right things to get you in the door and then proceed to undermine you at every turn, racial biases may very well be at the root of that behavior. But it tends to be confusing, and you may even start to question yourself. Similarly, relationships that become abusive over time almost never start that way. Even for most abusive relationships, physical violence is not a daily norm. We recognize that violence is harmful, but very often it gets excused away by things like alcohol and drug abuse. However, the non-physical indicators of abuse are far more prevalent from a health perspective, and they tend to be even more damaging in the long term. There are four primary sets of red flags that we see in abusive relationships. The first includes strategies that help the abusive partner establish control. These are things like jealousy, where they limit who you talk to and where you go; economic dependence, so that it will be harder for you to leave when things get difficult; intimidation, so that you fear bringing up issues that you are unhappy about because it may result in an unwarranted angry response; and finally, privilege, which often but not always revolves around gender roles and expectations. The second set of red flags are those that are much more subversive and involve strategies that make you question yourself. These include manipulation, getting you to cross your own limits and boundaries; gaslighting, which involves a denial of your reality; minimizing the hurtful things they've done, denying those things altogether sometimes, and blaming you for the conflict or for their actions. From my experience, people who are abusive are masterful at manipulating the narrative of the relationship. When I answered a domestic violence hotline at a shelter, I can't tell you how many people would call us looking for their partner or spouse and give me a long explanation about how they were the true victims. In fact, if you go back through that list of the four horsemen, criticism, contempt, defensiveness, and stonewalling, people who use abusive tactics against their partners tend to be remarkably skilled at convincing other people that they are the ones who have been mistreated in this way. This is why couples counseling is never recommended in cases of abuse. Third set of red flags involve limiting your access to others who may perceive the relationship differently. This involves social isolation and often shows up as having a partner who doesn't get along with your friends or family, or claims to be so in love with you that they just want to spend time with you and you alone. The final set of red flags involve establishing a fear that ending their relationship would be more difficult than staying in the relationship. This may include threats and coercion, statements about how they'd take custody of the kids if you left, or how they would exploit information they had about your weaknesses. Another variation is a threat to harm themselves by telling you they can't live without you, or that they would implode if they ever saw you with another person. People who use abusive relationship strategies don't fight fair. As an example, I like to use the analogy of a spitball and a hand grenade. If one person is feeling annoyed and launches the equivalent of a verbal spitball, like, "You couldn't call me to tell me you were running late, now dinner's cold and it's not good anymore." And then that spitball is returned with a hand grenade, explosive anger, slamming the table, throwing food in the trash. "I work hard for this family and you never appreciate a damn thing I do." And then as the day or days go on, that event gets minimized and the spitball is amplified. "Do you know how hard it is to come home to you nagging to me? You're so ungrateful for all the things I do for you." And the grenade is minimized. "You said the food was cold and dinner was ruined. What else was I supposed to do but throw it away?" This shows the power imbalance in an abusive relationship and the ways that gaslighting can be used to minimize that explosive action. So we've talked about the characteristics of very damaging relationships, and we're about to move on to strategies that can be employed to promote healthy relationships. However, before we get there, we need to address the limits of what healthy communication can do. Imagine that you had a partner or spouse who came home with a badly shattered, broken leg. Would you fix it by giving your partner lots of love and empathy? No. Yet, why do we often think we can fix people's behavior that stems from things like mental health disorders, alcohol or drug abuse or dependence, violence, personality disorders, or even their earlier life traumas? The items on this slide are not things that can be fixed as a couple or as a family. It may be helpful for you to learn about these conditions and issues so that you understand them better, but you cannot fix them. Only the people who are experiencing these conditions, issues, and behaviors can change them, and they will probably need professional help to do so. So what do we know about healthy relationships? First, they tend to be affirming. In fact, the magical ratio of affirming, empathetic, and validating compliments to complaints is 5-1. And interestingly, this ratio holds true in the workplace as well. When a person feels well validated, they are more likely to be open to hearing a complaint. In unstable relationships, that ratio is almost even at 0.8-1. What this should tell you is that critique doesn't feel good, even if it's well-meaning. And to be able to absorb that critique, you need to have a strong foundation of support. A second key component is having a lot of like. This is in contrast to thinking about love. Sometimes when we talk about love, it's from this grand attachment perspective. I am so in love with you that I just have to be with you. However, we know that we can love people and not necessarily be capable of having a healthy relationship with them. So that's where like comes in. Like means that you enjoy and appreciate who they are as a person. It doesn't mean that you like the same things necessarily. You don't have to like the same TV shows or activities or music. You just have to like them. For parents and caregivers, this like gets extended to unconditional positive regard for your kids. To develop healthy and safe attachments in their lives, children need to know that their parent or caregiver will like, accept, and love them no matter what they do. In this respect, you are distinguishing the person from the behavior. You may not always like the choices that your kids make, but they need to know that you will always like and love them. Finally, healthy relationships are characterized by people who are able to both set limits and boundaries for themselves and have those limits and boundaries respected by their partner. We want and need partners who encourage our growth. However, it's really important not to confuse someone who pushes our limits with someone who is actively helping us achieve our goals. Our final polling question is, which of the following strategies helps to restore humor and emotional engagement during an argument? I'm gonna show the poll again, scroll down. And the majority of you answered correctly, taking a 20-minute break. So in a moment, we will explain why. I'm gonna close the polls. So Julie Gottman is one of the researchers in the Gottman Institute and developed this model of a sound relationship house. These are the characteristics of relationships that tend to flourish with positive intimacy. A great place to start is with what she calls the love map. This involves asking deep questions of your partner that allow you to explore their hopes and dreams and inner world. Other foundational parts of this sound house include: 1, showing fondness and admiration for one another. 2, turning towards each other rather than turning away during times of stress or conflict. 3, having an overall positive perspective about the relationship. 4, managing conflict by showing a willingness to change and an openness to dialogue and a commitment to self-care. And then finally, sound relationship houses include people who support each other's dreams and growth, as well as supporting and creating shared dreams together. The Gottman Institute also developed what they call a set of antidotes to the 4 horsemen. The first is learning to soften your complaints, as well as situate them in that 5-to-1 ratio of positive to negative. This is really hard for couples who've been avoiding their conflict, and it's like having a terribly messy closet at home. If you keep throwing stuff in the closet and closing the door, it will become more and more overwhelming to sort through it all when you open it back up. So this is why if people have had conflict for a while, it takes a little bit of time for people to kind of slowly work through their complaints in a productive way. You do not want to do it all at once. The second antidote is to build a culture of appreciation. This means that you spend most of our time displaying your like for one another, as opposed to addressing the complaints. Other authors have referred to this as a love savings account or a love tank, similar to a gas tank in your car. If your love tank is empty, you're not able to move forward no matter how hard you try. And as a recovery plan, spending time restoring the love savings account is really important to do prior to addressing those complaints that you have. The third antidote is taking responsibility. This requires personal reflection and ownership. It also requires authentic apologies, learning, and most importantly, demonstrating actual changes in your behavior. The final antidote is something that we already mentioned in the poll, and that's taking a 20-minute break. Now, notice I didn't say a 2 or 3 hour break. However, 20 minutes is sufficient for a flooded person to de-stress their bodies. What people often find during arguments is that they become flooded with biochemicals that become really overwhelming, and your brain actually can't process reasonable decisions during that time. However, in 20 minutes, if somebody focuses on bringing their stress down, that will help restore the ability to reason and logic through difficult situations. Parent and caregiver relationships require some additional perspective to promote parenting health. My favorite resources has always been the Love and Logic books. When my kids were little, I started with the first set. And when they got older, I bought the Love and Logic with teens, and that was really fantastic. It's helpful to first identify parenting styles that tend to be damaging and really explore where you are with those different styles. So these include the helicopter parent, which tends to hover and rescue their children, which prevents them from learning life lessons and developing independence. The next is the drill sergeant style. This is a style that tends to hold really rigid expectations for behavior, doesn't allow children to question authority, and believes that obedience is valued above all. This style is very harmful to children. It restricts them from developing independence and restricts them from learning to problem solve on their own. The suggested parenting style is that of the consultant, who helps set healthy boundaries and limits, but offers children the opportunity to discuss these boundaries and consider the consequences of their actions. The essence of the Love and Logic model is allowing children to have natural consequences for the decisions that they make. The Gottman Institute extends this consultant style through what they call their emotion coaching model. This encourages parents to be really tuned into their children's feelings, to connect to those feelings using productive and non-blaming dialogue, to find appropriate ways to label and manage those emotions and talk about them, and then to help kids develop strategies for coping with those feelings. So a few resources that I recommend in terms of books. One of my favorite books is The 5 Love Languages, written by Gary Chapman. This explores 5 different styles that people typically have when they want to express their love. And it's really helpful to not only know your own style, but to learn the style of your partner. That helps you to learn how to speak their language. But it also helps them recognize what you need, how you define love, and what tells you that you're loved. I talked about the Parenting with Love and Logic books. Those are fantastic. A great webpage is the Gottman Institute's Gottman.com. There's tons of very helpful resources there. And then if anything that I said today about abusive relationships really speaks to you, I encourage you to reach out to One Safe Place. This is our local family justice center. There are 20 organizations that are housed at One Safe Place, and they have a variety of services that can help you navigate your options in an abusive relationship. And then finally, there's a really great podcast from the Gottman Institute as well called Small Things Often. These are just short little clips that help you think about different ways to promote health in your intimate partner relationships and with your children. So finally, I want to circle back and end where we began with another basketball analogy. If you recall, I mentioned a game against the Lakers where the Mavs were losing, and then they changed their strategy and came from behind for a final win. Every NBA team has at least one profoundly gifted superstar player. For the Mavs, that's Luka Doncic, and he averages typically about 28 points per game. But on that day when we were playing the Lakers, they launched such a heavy defense against Luka that they were effectively stifling his capacity to rack up those points. So he switched his strategy in the last half of the game and focused on getting the ball to his teammates, including this slam dunk by Dwight Powell, who typically averages 5 points per game, but on that day scored 25 points. And Luka scored 18 out of his typical 28 points per game. So what relationship lessons am I drawing here? First, even if you're a superstar, everyone is better off when each member of the family is supporting one another. And in the end, if you focus solely on getting your own baskets, you're probably still going to lose the game, especially when there are outside pressures getting in the way. So I'm going to put some source material up here. And I'm actually going to go ahead and close the PowerPoint. If you want a copy of these slides, we are happy to share them. But I'll go ahead and end the PowerPoint show and take any questions that people have. So, question from Emily Alexander. Can you talk about honoring your partner's love language when it's not the same as your own? His is number 1 and mine is number 5. So I struggle to give and receive. Yeah, this is a really tough one. And in reality, we rarely marry or live or get in a partnership with people who have our same love language. So what Gary Chapman recommends is that people learn how to speak other people's language. So once you know what your partner's love language is, the next thing that you should do is identify and really plan ways to speak to your partner in their love language. So if your partner's primary love language is physical affection and that's not yours, then you may have to basically plan out how to be more physically affectionate. Maybe you kind of almost schedule for yourself, before I leave, I'm going to make sure I kiss and hug them goodbye. And at the end of the day, when they come home, I'm going to spend some time just cuddling together or suggesting that we spend time cuddling together. So it's really kind of figuring out what that is and then making space out of your daily routine to do what your partner needs. Other questions? Or suggestions. I typically find that we have a lot of wisdom amongst each other. So I wonder if anybody else has any resources that they've found helpful in their lives. Okay. Katie, shall we stop recording? Oh, I'm getting some questions coming in here. Hold on. Is there evidence of a particular support being more helpful? I'm not sure exactly what's being asked there, but I'm guessing in terms of different kinds of relationship strategies, really the best relationship strategy to employ is displaying that sort of just really focusing on doing things that show your partner you really like who they are as a person. And so that kind of gets bundled together in those love languages as supporting their interests, encouraging them to do the things that they're interested in, asking them questions about the things that they're interested in, and giving them compliments, showing them that you see what their strengths are. And can I speak to healthy relationships in quarantine? I think one of the best quarantine strategies is the fact that the outdoors is outside. And that's one of the things that I recommend. I think people in quarantine have spent way too much time together, and spending time outside anyway is good for us. Being in an outdoors environment is very healthy. It is good for your spirit. It's good for your body. And so getting out there and taking a walk is helpful for the relationship, spending some time apart. But I also found with my kids, as they were doing homeschool, that was really becoming overwhelming for them to just be in their bedrooms all the time. So one of the things that I've been instituting is just a forced family walk together at the end of the day, and we go down to the river, and that's been incredibly impactful for them to. Even if they don't like it at first, they're really happy to just get out and get some fresh air. So I have another question. How do you find the right balance between the overly strict authoritarian parent and the overly involved helicopter parent? I'm nurturing and I know I need to let my kids solve their own problems, but I hate seeing them struggle too. I mean, that's really the essence of the challenge of parenting, is finding that middle place. And the way to avoid being an authoritarian parent is being a good listening parent, making sure that you allow your child to ask questions about why you've set some limits and boundaries and rules in place. If they're trying to push those, you give them ample opportunity to talk through and give their perspective. And I think it is perfectly okay for parents to acknowledge that they made a mistake, and to acknowledge maybe a child has a really good reason for you to change your initial rule that you had set and adapt it. And showing some adaptation as a parent is really great role modeling for kids for life. You want people to be able to influence each other. That's what happens in healthy relationships. So allowing your kids to have some influence, but only in a way that has been done with that reasonable dialogue. If there's good sound justification for doing it. Whereas sometimes kids need to still have that natural consequence. So you can listen to their feedback and you can say, well, I hear your feedback and I think you have some valid points. However, I really think it's important for us to continue with this consequence or continue with this rule. So being able to show some adaptation, I think, is a good place for the middle ground, but also holding on to some of those rules that you think are crucial for their well-being. Let's see. If you know somebody's in an abusive marriage, what advice would you give? What is the hope for change in a realistic time? That's a really tough question. What research has shown is that most relationships that include some violence tend to get less violent over time. Some of them do exactly the opposite, and they tend to escalate and get more dangerous. And when I worked in a domestic violence shelter, that was really the kind of relationship that we saw all the time, that escalating one. So most of us who've worked in the field, when we think about abusive relationships, we tend to not be very hopeful about them getting better. But part of that is because we've seen the very worst. And there are many people who are abusive, who have personality disorders, and they are not ever going to change. However, there are people who, once they acknowledge and own what they've done wrong and actually get help for those things, do have the capacity to change. So that would be my advice, is that if your partner seems to recognize that they are abusive and they don't want to be that way and they're willing to get help, then it may be worthwhile allowing them some space to get the help that they need. The one thing, though, that is really important for anybody in an abusive relationship to think through and to recognize is that leaving is when the relationship becomes at its worst. That's the most dangerous time for people, and if you're in that relationship, you know your partner better than anybody else, and you know what kinds of things are going to set them off. So really thinking about your exit strategy very carefully, getting help from other people to think through that very carefully, I think is really important. And a realistic time frame for change. Yeah, I'm not really sure what a realistic time frame for change. Most intervention programs that help people who have battered their partners last about 6 months. That's generally considered kind of an appropriate time frame for an intervention to work, at least.
Okay, thank you, Dr. Spence. Do we have any questions from the pre-submitted list that we need to address, or did we cover all of them?
Let me take a look. There's a question about how to take care of yourself when someone you love, like your child, is in crisis. That's a great question. I think if we go back to kind of thinking about that life balance approach, taking care of yourself is really crucial. And I think it's really important. Many people are single parents and don't feel like they have the opportunity to do self-care. So getting an adequate amount of support in your life. If you don't feel like you have a strong support system, that would be one area that I would focus on if you have family members in crisis, is finding other people who can step in with you and give you a place to vent, give you some additional resources, and sometimes just help you take time away for yourself. I'm trying to read these questions. Let's see. So there's some questions about how to recognize what's normal in a relationship and what's toxic. I think our 4 horsemen is a good frame to look at that in, as well as those characteristics of abusive relationships. If you see any of those, that maybe should give you some pause to get some professional help. First, for just yourself, and to get other people's perspectives on what's going on. I think that's really valuable. Sometimes we get so manipulated that we start buying into the excuses and the denial and the minimization and the gaslighting of our partners. And it takes us having some separation and getting other people's feedback to recognize what is fixable versus what is not fixable. There's one that says the expectations placed on teachers is unrealistic. I don't know if there's anything we can do to try and balance our time. I think we need to become stronger advocates for ourselves. How can we add this into the mix? I think you've basically said it, becoming a stronger advocate. It's not always helpful to be an advocate all by yourself, especially in a situation where the work environment is kind of critically difficult or consistently difficult for a group of people. So grouping together with other teachers and requesting change, I think, is really important. Don't try to do that on your own. I think that's all the questions.
Okay, Thank you so much, Dr. Spence, for your time. Your presentation was full of helpful, realistic tips and tricks too. And I think it's, widely realistic for all of us here. We've either experienced this ourselves or have somebody in our lives that we've seen go through this. So I'm glad to have this as a resource that can live on forever. So thanks so much for taking your time this afternoon to speak to us.
Thank you. Thanks for everybody for coming.
Of course. For all of the Fort Worth ISD staff, the follow-up survey email will be sent out Monday morning. This is because we need time for all of the late registrants to get put into our system so that we can go mark them as attended, and then you will receive that email. It'll again scheduled for Monday morning, and that is your third step in being entered into win the month's prize. So don't forget to do that, and we hope to see you for our last webinar. It is scheduled for May 25th. It is on nutrition. That flyer will come out to you in about a week. So until then, this will be put up on YouTube. And again, thank you, Dr. Spence.
Thank you.